Story is one that comes from a collection of stories by Charles Chestnut called The Conjure Woman. And you can find it on a recording of mine called Pine Trees and Frog's Legs. Down in central North Carolina, there was a man by the name of Marable McSwain who had one of the largest slave-owning plantations in the county. Had a whole heap of folk working his land. But the one that stood out was one named Sandy. One of the best workers Marable McSwain had ever had. Strong, could plow and plant and haul timber and build things. He was such a good worker that sometimes old Marable McSwain would loan him to some of the other plantation owners so that he could do some work with them and loan him to another plantation. And it got to the point where every single one of old Marable McSwain's children wanted their daddy to give them Sandy as a wedding present. Well, he didn't want to do that, but what he would do was loan Sandy out to one of his kids for a month or so, and maybe to another one for another month or so, until he had gotten around to helping all of them establish their own farms. But sometimes when he was out on loan, it would be for long periods of time, sometimes 2 to 3 months. And once when he was gone, a speculator come through that plantation, and old Marable McSwain and that speculator ended up swapping 2 people, one woman for another. But the woman he had swapped was Sandy's wife. And when Sandy got back and saw that she was gone, his heart almost broke from grief, almost couldn't function. Old Marable offered him $1, said that should cover the loss. And Sandy said, "This is a man that don't know nothing about family." For a long time, he grieved. It was hard for him to do anything at all. And this new woman who'd been swapped in this deal took note of it and behaved very tenderly towards Sandy, understanding that grief and how deep it was in his broken heart. And she tended to him and cooked him little things. And over time, his heart began to soften, and he looked up and saw this woman and saw her heart. And pretty soon, they became a couple. And some say there was one of the lovingest couples they had seen on that plantation for a long time. Wasn't nothing that Sandy wouldn't do for Teenie, wasn't nothing Teenie wouldn't do for Sandy. Once she got sick, and he nursed her all night long, stayed awake, and walked on out to the field at the crack of dawn, just like he had had a regular night of sleep. But one day, old Marable McSwain's uncle come up the drive and told him about a big timber project that he had coming, and wanted a hand that could work really hard. And so old Marable said, "Well, I can give you Sandy." So he went to prepare and was going to come back and get Sandy in another couple of days. And Sandy was sitting in a cabin with Teenie, just staring into the fire. Start talking out loud, thinking out loud. I wish I could be a rock or stump or something that will keep me here so I don't have to go off nowhere else. If I left here and came back and you wasn't here, I don't know what I'd do. I don't think I could live. I just want to be something that would keep me here and keep me from being loaned out from plantation to plantation. And Teenie just listened quietly. And after a while, she spoke. She said, "Sandy, there's something I ain't never told you. I used to be a conjure woman. But since I got religion, I ain't done no conjuring, but desperate times call for desperate action. And if you want to, I can turn you into something so you don't have to go nowhere." Well, hearing that, Sandy stopped talking for a moment, kept staring into the fire, and she said, "Well, I can maybe turn you into rabbit or something. He said, oh, no, the hounds might get me. She said, well, what about like a mockingbird or something like that? No, sparrowhawk might get me. I just mean like a rock, a stump or something that'll keep me grounded here, keep me staying here. And she said, if you want to, I can turn you into a pine tree. You won't have no ears, you won't be able to speak, but every now and then I can turn you back from time to time and we can have our time together. And so they decided and agreed that that's what they would do. And each day, they walked down past the grove of trees towards the fields to work. They would take note of places where a new tree could be placed. And sure enough, about a week or so later, she went out in the woods and got the herbs and twigs and all that she might need. And in that time, Omabu's uncle hadn't come back yet. She put all of that mixture into a little gourd and started to mix it all together to make a paste. And they waited until it was a black dark that had descended on that farm. And all the fires were out and all was quiet in the cabins. The two of them left the cabins and went down among those row of trees and went to one of those places where she could put another one in. Sandy stood right in that spot and she began to get that goofer mixture and rub it all over his body. Starting down at his feet and his ankles and moving up his legs, his thighs, his stomach and his back, his arms, his shoulder, his neck, his cheek, his face, all over his head. And when she was done with the mixture, there standing in front of her was a tall pine tree. Rubbed her hand along the side of the bar, leaned her head against it, turned and walked back up to the cabin. Lay down. Early that morning, those field hands walked out towards the field. They walked past that spot where there's a pine tree that hadn't been there before. And no one said nothing at first, just looking from one to the other. But it was Marabou, who was just so agitated because Sandy wasn't around. He couldn't figure out what would happen. He had had this man since he was a boy, since he was about 12 years old. He couldn't figure out what might have happened. He couldn't believe that he might have run away. And he saw how these two were with each other. He couldn't believe that Teeny would have helped him run away. He couldn't figure out what happened. He got his dogs and they went to the cabin and sniffed Sandy's clothes. He let them dogs go and they shot right to that pine tree that Sandy had been turned into, and they barked and they howled and they pawed. It was the queerest thing that he ever seen. And he tied the dogs up once again and took them all the way around to the other side of the swamp and let them go, and they shot right back across that swamp, right back to that pine tree that Sandy had been turned into, and they barked and they howled and they pawed and they jumped all over the sides. He couldn't figure out what it was. All he could think of was that maybe he climbed a tree and had a mule or a horse or something that he jumped down on and went on off to freedom, even leaving this woman behind. Well, for a while, there was a lot of mumbling and talk among those who worked those fields. And Teeny waited until a lot of that had died down. And then one night, when that black dark descended on that plantation and the fires had gone out in the cabins and all was quiet, she gathered up the herbs that she had collected, made a paste, and walked on down to that spot where Sandy was and began to rub it all over that tree and turned him back into himself, and they had their time together. And then she rubbed the mixture back and set him up there tall and straight. Well, not everything went so well. Once a woodpecker start pecking on the side of that tree. And when she turned him back, there was a deep hole in his arm. She had to get a powerful group of mixture to heal that sore before she turned him back. And another time, old Marabou sent some of the field hands to go chop some turpentine boxes, and the heads of the axes were glancing off the sides of it. But when she turned him back, he had cuts all down his legs, and she had to get a really powerful group of mixture to heal that. And they decided that this was just going to be too dangerous, and she would figure out some other kind of mixture that she could turn both of them into a couple of foxes, and both of them could run off together and be free together. So she decided to do it the very next night. She set him down there for the last time, went back to her cabin. And early in the morning, old Marabou McSwain's son come tearing up the driveway in the wagon, talking about his wife was sick, he needed somebody to nurse her. Well, old Marabou McSwain's wife, so Teeny, send her, she's the best nurse that I got. And he went to the cabin and told her that he needed her to come, and she tried to think of some kind of excuse that she wouldn't have to go. And she said, but I don't have nothing else to wear. She said, you can just wear what you got on and just wash it out when you need it. And she tried to think, she could not think of anything. He said, just get in the wagon. And there was nothing she could do. She couldn't go down to tell Sandy what was going on. And she got in the wagon and went off with old Marabou's son. Well, for a long time, old Marabou McSwain's wife had been after him about building her a kitchen. And he decided that very day that he would start that process, and he gathered together some field hands and sent them to cut some pine, and I don't know how it come to be, but he sent them right to that pine tree that Sandy had been turned into. And they started with the axes chopping, and the heads of the axes would fall off the top of them, and all of a sudden queer sounds when they got a saw started emerging out of that thing. Every time they put a cut in it, they would hear these sounds emerging. They couldn't figure out whether it was coming from the tree or under the ground or a banshee in the woods or whatever it was. It took them almost the whole day to get that tree down and clean it up and cut off those branches, and then they had to get it into the wagon and get it up to the sawmill, and they would chain it down. They got halfway across that swamp, and the chains broke, and it fell off that wagon and rolled back. It took them the rest of the night to get it up there. And finally they got it to the sawmill, put it on the belt, and decided they would wait until the next day to cut that thing the way they needed. Well, sure enough, that very next morning, old Marabou McSwain's son brought Teeny back. His wife wasn't sick, just needed some attention. And she went down to see where Sandy was, to tell him why she hadn't come. And when she saw those pieces laid out all over, she went almost out of her mind, and she saw the tracks from the wagon leading up to the sawmill, and she ran and ran and ran and ran until she got to the top, and that belt started to move just when she got there, and she jumped on top of it and yelled, Sandy, Sandy! And then she remembered he didn't have no ears, and she had her pouch with her goof of mixture. She went to put it on, and he snatched her back just as that saw started to cut through that thing, and all those weird sounds started to emerge once again, and they cut it all up. And she was out of her mind, rambling, and finally old Marabou put her in the smokehouse and let her sit there for a couple of days till she quieted down. Thought about selling her, but decided to let her go out in the field and take care of the babies while their mothers worked. Well, they started to put that kitchen up with that wood, but they couldn't get the walls square. Put the pegs up to hold the pots, they'd fall right back off the wall. And at night, you would see Teeny walking back and forth, rubbing her hands on the door jambs. Couldn't get nobody to work in it, and all those in the slave community knew that that kitchen was haunted with Sandy's spirit. Finally, I had to dismantle it and take it down. Well, soon after, emancipation come. And some of those that had worked at plantation took that wood that had been sitting there, that lumber, and they built themselves a schoolhouse. And at night, they would see Teeny walking back and forth in front of that schoolhouse, rubbing her hands on the sides of the walls. And early one morning, one of the older boys came in to light that pot-bellied stove to heat it before the little ones came, and found Teeny on the floor, died of a broken heart. Well, that schoolhouse is still standing. But they say that structure and any other structure that was made from the wood that came from that pine tree that Sandy had been turned into is going to be haunted until the last plank crumbles into sawdust. Anybody who was there knows that's the way that story